And now the Deeper Thinking podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. There's a moment between apology and explanation, between offering context and saying nothing, that most people pass through without noticing. But for those whose minds move differently, whose timing is offbeat, whose expressions misalign with social tempo, that space becomes the entire terrain. This essay begins there, in that barely visible pause. Not to resolve it, but to live inside it long enough to understand what it asks of us. What does it mean to communicate when fluency is not a given, when legibility feels conditional, and when silence is both protection and exile? Drawing from lived experience and philosophical depth, this essay traces how neurodivergent individuals often inhabit a recursive structure of self-monitoring, preemptive framing, and effective compression. It explores how communication becomes not a tool of connection, but a site of ethical tension, where every gesture risks misreading and every pause is filled with unspeakable calculation. The aim is not to offer diagnosis or remedy, but to map the space where voice falters and yet still matters. With insight from thinkers like Sartre, Levinas, who emphasizes our responsibility to others before the self, Cavarero, a philosopher concerned with voice and relation, and Ettinger, it builds an ethics of asymmetric resonance, one that honors hesitation, refuses correction as default, and treats Misfit as a method, not a mistake. This is not an argument, it is a refusal architecture, a design where presence is not filtered through performance, a slow construction, built in fragments and folds, a recursive attention to what remains unresolved, and a listening practice for what resists repair. It invites the reader not toward clarity, but toward fidelity, to moments that misalign, to gestures that loop, to silences that speak without translating. If there is meaning here, it may not arrive on time, it may not arrive at all. But even that, in this structure, is a kind of presence. There's a moment, barely perceptible, often erased, between the social reflex and the internal translation. A pause between the apology you don't quite owe and the explanation you don't quite want to give. It's not silence in the strict sense, but a soft field where silence and speech are entangled. Here, intimacy and discomfort arrive dressed as twins. To say nothing is to risk misunderstanding, but to say too much risks a performance, a dislocation of closeness. The neurodivergent body knows this space intimately. It does not just live in it, it negotiates it continuously, caught between an internal architecture that demands framing and an external world that often misreads the frame as overreach. What makes this space unbearable isn't the failure to communicate. It's the failure of every available form to hold the precision needed. The desire to clarify a gesture, to offer a context for a delay, a wince, a retreat, becomes freighted with impossible choices. Is it for them or for me? Am I managing their comfort or protecting my own coherence? The risk isn't only in being misunderstood, it's in over-explaining and rupturing the fragile social fabric with too much truth. So instead we compress, we say it's fine or say nothing, and in doing so we preserve the interaction but sacrifice the possibility of being fully known. This is not merely a social dilemma, it's a philosophical structure. It reveals how language fails when asked to perform double duty, as shield and disclosure, as intimacy and avoidance. To frame this space as awkwardness or insecurity is to miss its deeper architecture. It is a recursive negotiation of relational ethics under conditions of misfit. Here, shame is not simply an emotion, it is a structural residue, left over from previous misalignments. It builds up quietly and distorts not just how we express ourselves, but whether we feel expression is survivable at all. Philosopher Emmanuel Levinas argued that the self is constituted in the face of the other, that we are responsible to the other before we are even aware of it. But for the neurodivergent self, this responsibility often carries a hidden surcharge to anticipate discomfort, to frame traits that resist ease, to foreclose misunderstanding before it arrives. In this way, the act of simply being becomes burdened with preemptive translation. The effort to be legible erodes the possibility of being free. What emerges is not just exhaustion, but a collapse in the ethics of presence. When existence itself feels like a social overstep, the only viable option appears to be withdrawal. But what if this space, this in-between, could be restructured? What if we refused both the silence and the overshare and built a new mode of communication that did not require self-erasure as its cost? The desire to speak and the fear of misfiring are not opposites, they're symptoms of the same fracture. To exist neurodivergently in a neurotypical frame is to internalize a split between intention and reception, between authenticity and intelligibility. The psychological toll of this split is cumulative. What begins as an effort to clarify quickly becomes a strategy of survival. The problem is not merely that one feels misunderstood, but that one begins to preemptively strip language of its emotional range in order to stay within acceptable bounds. Expression becomes performance, communication becomes risk management, and slowly the self becomes a function of anticipated response rather than internal coherence. Cognitive theories of mind suggest that we model others' thoughts to predict behavior. This is the basis of empathy, of social fluency. But for many neurodivergent people, this modeling system is either hyperactive or maladaptive. Hyper-empathy results in over-identifying with another's potential discomfort, leading to self-erasure. Under-empathy or non-normative modeling results in being perceived as cold or awkward, even when one is simply honest. Both distortions produce shame, not as a feeling, but as a structural condition. Shame in this architecture is not about regret. It is about misalignment becoming visible. And it's in that moment of visibility, when the gap between intention and interpretation is exposed, that the psychic rupture occurs. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that shame is shame of oneself before the other, not because the other has condemned us, but because we have seen ourselves through their gaze. This external gaze, when internalized, doesn't just affect behavior, it alters the construction of identity itself. In neurodivergent experience, the gaze is often anticipatory. It precedes the action, shaping it in advance, stifling the potential of what might have been expressed. The body learns to behave in preemptive compliance with imagined judgment. We rehearse explanations we never give. We apologize for gestures no one noticed. We quiet ourselves not to hide, but to reduce the likelihood of being framed as too much. This is not a personal failing. It is the result of an environment that demands legibility without reciprocity. A culture that expects those who differ to provide both translation and restraint. In psychoanalytic terms, this becomes a form of internalized policing. The superego is trained not to uphold virtue, but to avoid interpretive rupture. And in that space, the ethical dimension of voice collapses. We speak not to connect, but to minimize friction. We withhold not to protect others, but because the cost of even gentle friction is disproportionately high. What philosophy offers here is not just analysis, but refusal. To refuse the architecture that makes presence conditional on seamless reception. To construct instead a mode of being that allows for friction without punishment, misfire without erasure. This is not about better explaining ourselves. It is about building environments where the pressure to explain dissolves. If we take this seriously, not as a social inconvenience, but as an ontological structure, we begin to see that the experience of Misfit is not about the content of a conversation, but about the architecture within which conversation becomes possible. The neurodivergent self does not simply process differently, it inhabits a different rhythm, a different pressure system, a different ethic of attention. And in a society obsessed with fluency, ease, and immediacy, these differences are often treated as deficits. The result is a kind of epistemic compression. The range of intelligible being narrows, and all that does not conform is left unspoken, or worse, spoken but unheard. This compression has philosophical consequences. To be misheard or to be perpetually required to explain is not merely frustrating, it is a condition that erodes one's access to shared reality. The phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty insisted that perception is always embodied, always situated, always relational. But when your perception is routinely filtered through suspicion, when sincerity is mistaken for rudeness or brevity for indifference, you begin to lose faith not only in language, but in the possibility that language could ever be enough. A kind of quiet nihilism creeps in, not the dramatic despair of meaninglessness, but the slow recognition that clarity may always be a one-way mirror. You see out. Others see only their reflection. Psychologically, this becomes a recursive bind. You want to be understood, but every attempt feels like overreach. You try to be generous, but generosity is misread. You retreat, but the retreat is interpreted as coldness. Over time, the self adapts not by resolving the contradiction, but by housing it, learning to survive within a loop of self-containment and deferred expression. Cognitive behavioral models might diagnose this as a pattern of social withdrawal, but the deeper structure is philosophical, a loss of faith in shared frameworks, in the ethical capacity of others to meet difference without converting it. Philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, concerned with how language forms the boundary of our world, wrote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." But for the neurodivergent thinker, the world is not merely limited by language, it is misaligned by its expectations. What is needed is not just more space to speak, but a different model of conversation altogether. One in which the burden of adaptation is not always unidirectional. One where drift is allowed, where rhythm is not policed, where the refusal to explain is not met with suspicion, but with openness. Where not knowing what to say is not a rupture, but an offering. Such a model would begin not with clarity, but with attunement, not with fluency, but with presence. It would treat the awkward pause not as a glitch to be edited out, but as a site of ethical attention, a space where new ways of being together might take shape. What this asks of us is not better etiquette or more inclusive policies, but a deeper reconfiguration of relational ethics, one that begins with the acceptance that mutual understanding is not the goal, but the byproduct of sustained and asymmetrical attention. The philosopher Lisa Genther, writing on solitary confinement, speaks of ethical loneliness, the feeling of being abandoned not just by individuals, but by the structure of recognition itself. While this may seem an extreme comparison, the emotional terrain is not entirely dissimilar. To live in a world that constantly misreads your pauses, your silences, your indirect paths of articulation, is to be exiled not from speech, but from the conditions that make speech meaningful. This exile is often invisible. It doesn't announce itself through protest or spectacle. Instead, it lingers quietly in the skipped reply, the over-rehearsed message, the email never sent. It marks itself through exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from effort, but from constant modulation. Every social interaction becomes a subtle calibration exercise. How much can I say before I become unrelatable? How little can I say before I disappear entirely? And in that calibration, the self is split again and again, not in the dramatic fashion of trauma, but in the quiet, recursive way that expectations override presence. In psychological terms, this is not merely anxiety, it is a habituated pattern of internal surveillance. The neurodivergent person often becomes a chronic interpreter of themselves, anticipating social consequences before they arrive. This is not social hyper-awareness in the conventional sense, but a form of preemptive damage control. It is not about being liked. It is about being legible enough to avoid correction, pity, or alienation. The nervous system adapts accordingly. Hypervigilance without an identifiable threat, emotional fatigue without a single point of origin. What emerges is not a personality trait, but a state of being that is both protective and corrosive. From a philosophical standpoint, this reveals the inadequacy of liberal models of communication, which assume that agency lies in the act of speaking and that justice arrives when everyone gets a turn. But not all turns are equal. Not all speech is free of survival costs, and not all silence is chosen. If we think instead with thinkers like Adriana Cavarero, who theorizes identity as something voiced, not visual, then the stakes of misrecognition become existential, not just social. This is why the usual prescriptions, just be yourself, don't overthink it, ring hollow. They presume a symmetry of interpretation that doesn't exist. What's needed is not encouragement, but structural reimagining, a conversational world that can hold multiple speeds, where ambiguity is not a threat, but a terrain to dwell in. Such a world wouldn't just accommodate difference, it would learn from it. It would understand that slowness, hesitance, and awkwardness are not problems to be solved, but modalities of care. To treat hesitance as care is to invert the usual grammar of interaction. In a culture obsessed with immediacy, delay is often read as incompetence or avoidance. But what if delay is deliberation? What if the pause is not a glitch but a gesture, a way of making room for presence to catch up with expression? This reorientation does not come naturally in systems built for speed. In education, in workplaces, in friendships, we are rewarded for clarity, for quickness, for the ability to explain ourselves in real time. But the neurodivergent temporality is rarely real time. It loops, it gathers, it halts, not out of uncertainty, but because certainty would be a form of betrayal. This is where phenomenology becomes useful again, not as abstraction, but as grounding. Edmund Husserl described the present not as a fixed point, but as a moving horizon, saturated with memory and anticipation. For those whose experience of the world is structured by recursive attention, by loops of thought that do not resolve but reconfigure, presence cannot be reduced to what is said. It includes what is unsaid, what is still forming, what resists closure. To honour that form of presence is not to indulge delay, but to recalibrate what counts as timely. It is to treat perception as an unfolding event, not a transmissible fact. Psychologically, this also means reconsidering the metrics of connection. So much of contemporary relational language hinges on empathy, but empathy, as it is usually framed, presumes a kind of cognitive mirroring. I understand you because I can feel what you feel. Yet for many neurodivergent people, what they feel does not arrive in forms easily mirrored. It may arrive as delayed resonance or effect without narrative or sensation without expression. The failure of others to mirror this is not cruelty, it's structural incompatibility. And so the attempt to connect becomes an ongoing dance between exposure and interpretation, risk and misfire, with very little feedback that confirms the attempt was successful. And still we try, because the alternative, total silence, is not freedom, it's exile. This is the paradox. Silence protects, but it also isolates. Speech risks misunderstanding, but it's the only way anything might change. So we live in the fold, we compose with fragments, we offer gestures instead of statements, rhythms instead of resolutions. And maybe that is not a compromise, but a different ethic of expression altogether. Psychoanalyst and philosopher Brache Ettinger offers the idea of the matrixial border space, a shared psychic field where subjectivities touch without merging, where vulnerability is not consumed but held. This model resists the drive toward clarity as conquest and instead foregrounds what she calls co-emergence. It's a model that allows for the unfinished, the hesitant, the misaligned to still belong. Not because they are eventually resolved, but because their unresolvedness is the relational ground itself. What would it mean to build conversations this way? Not to fix the gaps, but to dwell in them. To accept that awkwardness may be the most honest form of attention we have, that slowness may not be a symptom, but a strategy, that the failure to explain might in the right context be a gift. And this is where the architecture completes itself, not in resolution, but in refusal. The refusal to fix the gap, to name the silence too soon, to smooth over the moment of misfit with premature coherence. Instead, the silence remains, not as absence, but as signal, not as a failure to express, but as an insistence that some experiences resist the compression of shared language. The neurodivergent voice in this structure becomes not a deviation, but a method. It's looping, hesitating, offbeat rhythm is not a flaw. It is a structural proposal, a form of philosophical timekeeping that resists synchrony in favour of situated presence. What does it mean to build from that? Not just accommodate it, not just soften the edges of dominant modes, but to take seriously the proposition that divergence offers a better architecture for attention, a different relation to knowing, to speaking, to being with. The philosopher Gilles Deleuze once wrote that a concept is a brick. It can be used to build a courthouse of reason, or it can be thrown through the window. Perhaps neurodivergent communication throws not bricks but rhythms, odd, asymmetrical rhythms, through the windows of seamless interaction, fracturing the illusion that understanding was ever clean, or mutual, or easy. And yet, we can't romanticize refusal without naming its price. Withdrawal, while protective, is also erosive. What begins as self-preservation can calcify into isolation. One missed invitation becomes several. One conversation left unsent slowly becomes an entire language unspoken. The cost is not simply social, it is epistemic. A person begins to lose access to the relational feedback that refines thought, that grounds emotional nuance, that confirms one's presence is not just tolerated but wanted. Over time, silence stops being a tactic and starts becoming a form. Not chosen, but inherited. Not quiet, but empty. This is why the refusal must be held in relation, not in retreat. Not all silence is the same. Some is a boundary, some is a collapse, some protects, some punishes. The work is to learn which is which, to stay close enough to difference that we can hear the inflection of what is not said. This requires more than inclusion, it requires infrastructure. Patience must be built into the shape of things. Misfires must be planned for, not corrected, but housed. Presence must be measured not by its smoothness, but by its endurance under friction. For practitioners and facilitators, the work might begin with building environments that metabolize uneven tempo, where conversation does not depend on speed, but on continuity. For theorists and designers, it means imagining architectures, digital, educational, spatial, that hold interpretive lag without collapsing into correction. And for those who carry the misfit internally, it means recognizing that even isolation has a shape, and that naming it is not surrender, it is fidelity. So we return to that initial space, the one between apology and explanation, between too much and nothing. We do not fill it, we do not fix it, we stay. And in staying, something shifts. The pause is no longer awkward, it is spacious. The silence is no longer a burden, it is a form. And the misfit is no longer something to overcome, it is the structure in which care becomes possible. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.